There are things people whisper about in hushed tones long after the candles have been extinguished. Secrets that burrow into the collective memory of a place, refusing to fade even when those who lived through them are buried 6 feet under cold New England soil. In Salem, Massachusetts, yes, that's Salem, there existed in the year 1833 a woman whose obsession with recording births would unravel a conspiracy so deeply woven into the fabric of society that when the truth finally emerged, it would shatter families, end careers, and leave questions that haunt historians to this very day. Her name was Rebecca Miles, and what she documented in secret ledgers hidden beneath the floorboards of her modest home on Charter Street would become one of the most disturbing chronicles ever discovered in American history. But here's what makes this story truly unsettling. Rebecca wasn't a mad woman. She wasn't driven by delusion or supernatural visions. She was a midwife, a respected one, who simply started noticing patterns that no one else dared to see, patterns in the babies she delivered, patterns that once recognized could never be ignored. The question that kept Rebecca awake through countless nights, the question that drove her to risk everything, was deceptively simple. Why were so many of Salem's most prominent families hiding the truth about their children? And more disturbingly, what were they doing with the children who didn't fit their carefully constructed lies? Rebecca Miles came to Salem in 1828, 5 years before the events that would define her life's final chapter. She was 26 years old, a widow from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where her husband had died in a shipping accident that left her with nothing but debts and a skill she'd learned from her grandmother, the ancient art of midwifery. Salem in 1828 was a city trying desperately to forget its past. Nearly a century and a half after the witch trials had stained its reputation, Salem's elite families worked tirelessly to rebrand their home as a center of maritime commerce and respectability. The Crown and Shield family, the Peabody family, the Derby family. These were names that commanded respect throughout New England, names associated with shipping fortunes, political influence, and social prominence. Rebecca established herself quickly. Midwifery was one of the few professions where a woman could earn a legitimate living, and Rebecca proved to be exceptionally skilled. She had a gentle manner with laboring mothers, steady hands during difficult deliveries, and most importantly, she possessed what Salem's wealthy families valued above all else: discretion. In the houses of Salem's elite, Rebecca was present during the most vulnerable, intimate moments of life. She witnessed the fear in young brides' eyes during first labors, the relief of mothers who survived childbirth when so many didn't, and the unspoken tensions that existed behind the polished facades of respectable families. But Rebecca possessed something else that would prove both blessing and curse: an exceptional memory for details. She remembered dates with perfect clarity. She remembered the physical characteristics of every infant she delivered. And she remembered the stories families told about their children, stories that, over time, began to contradict themselves in ways that troubled her deeply. The first inconsistency Rebecca noticed occurred in the spring of 1830, during the delivery of Margaret Harrington's 4th child. The Harrington family owned one of Salem's largest shipping firms, and Margaret was the picture of proper society: refined, educated, always appropriately dressed and mannered. Rebecca had delivered Margaret's 3rd child 18 months earlier, a healthy boy with distinctive red hair that matched his father's. But this 4th child, a girl, had features that seemed unexpected. Dark eyes where both parents had light ones, a complexion several shades deeper than either Margaret or her husband Robert possessed. Rebecca said nothing, of course. Variations in infant appearance were common, and she'd learned long ago that commenting on such matters was the quickest way to lose wealthy clients. What troubled Rebecca wasn't the child's appearance, it was Margaret's reaction to it. The moment the baby was cleaned and wrapped, Margaret turned her face to the wall and refused to look at her daughter. Robert Harrington, who'd been pacing downstairs, came up only long enough to glance at the infant before leaving the room without a word. "Mrs. "Harrington," Rebecca had said gently, "your daughter is healthy and strong. Would you like to hold her?" Margaret's response was cold, distant. "Take her to the nursery. The wet nurse will tend to her." Rebecca had delivered dozens of babies by then, and she'd seen the full range of maternal reactions: joy, relief, exhaustion, fear. But Margaret's complete detachment was different. It was as if she were looking at a problem that needed to be solved, not a child she'd carried for 9 months. 3 weeks later, Rebecca was called to the Harrington house for a follow-up visit. She expected to check on both mother and infant, but when she arrived, she was told the baby had died of fever. The burial had already taken place, quickly and quietly, in the family plot. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Rebecca offered, genuinely sympathetic despite her confusion. The infant had been perfectly healthy when she'd last seen her. Margaret accepted her condolences with a strange calmness. "It's God's will," she said simply. "Some children aren't meant for this world." But here's what haunted Rebecca as she walked home that evening. Through the window of the Harrington nursery, she'd glimpsed a cradle with an infant sleeping peacefully inside. An infant who appeared to be exactly the age Margaret's daughter would have been. When Rebecca delicately inquired with the housekeeper, she was told the Harringtons were caring for their niece while her mother recovered from an illness. The child's name was Charlotte, and she would be staying with the family indefinitely. Rebecca examined the infant and noticed immediately what anyone with eyes could see. This was no niece. This was a completely different baby than the one she delivered 3 weeks earlier. Different hair color, different facial structure, different everything, except the age. The Harringtons had replaced their daughter. That night, Rebecca sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold before her, trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed. Perhaps she was wrong. Perhaps grief and exhaustion had confused her memory. Perhaps the baby she'd glimpsed truly was a visiting niece, and the timing was merely coincidence. But Rebecca knew her own mind, and she knew what she'd seen. The Harringtons' biological daughter had been healthy and alive. Now she was officially dead and buried, replaced by a different infant who would be raised as their own. The question was, why? Rebecca tried to dismiss it. Wealthy families had their reasons for doing things, reasons that weren't her business to question. Her role was to deliver babies safely and leave the rest to God and the parents. Getting involved in family matters beyond her professional duties was a recipe for losing clients and her reputation. But the question gnawed at her. It burrowed into her thoughts during quiet moments, kept her awake when she should have been sleeping. And once she started looking for similar patterns, she began seeing them everywhere. In October of 1830, Rebecca delivered twins for Catherine Eldridge, wife of a prominent banker. One twin was robust and healthy, with the fair complexion common to the Eldridge family. The other twin was smaller, weaker, and had features that didn't quite match either parent. Rebecca managed to stabilize the weaker twins' breathing and left both infants nursing peacefully. When Rebecca returned 2 days later for a follow-up visit, she was informed that the smaller twin had failed to thrive and died within hours of birth. Only one twin remained, the one who looked like an Eldridge. "I'm confused," Rebecca said carefully to Catherine. "When I left, both children were feeding well. The smaller baby's breathing had improved significantly." Catherine's face remained impassive. "You must be mistaken, Mrs. Miles. The weak one never took breath properly. It was over quickly, a blessing really." But Rebecca had been a midwife long enough to know the difference between a dying infant and one who was stabilizing. She'd seen the smaller twin latch onto the wet nurse's breast and feed successfully. She'd heard the healthy cry of a baby with clear lungs. Now that baby was supposedly dead, buried in the family plot with a tiny marker that read, "Born and died October 17th, 1830. What disturbed Rebecca most wasn't just the lie, it was the efficiency of it. The baby had been declared dead, buried, and memorialized within 48 hours. No questions asked, no lingering grief. just a smooth, practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time such a thing had happened. Rebecca started keeping notes. It began innocently enough. She'd always maintained basic records of her deliveries for her own reference. Date, family name, sex of child, any complications during birth, standard information any midwife might track. But now, Rebecca began recording additional details. Physical characteristics of the infants, hair color, eye color, skin tone, distinctive features. She noted the reactions of parents to their newborns, particularly when those reactions seemed unusual. She tracked which families reported infant deaths shortly after birth and under what circumstances. And she began noticing a pattern so consistent, so deliberate, that it couldn't possibly be coincidence. Wealthy Salem families were systematically replacing babies who didn't meet certain criteria with babies who did. But where were they getting the replacement babies? And what was happening to the original infants who were being erased from existence? The answer to the first question came in the winter of 1831, during a bitterly cold January that froze the harbor solid and left Salem buried under weeks of snow. Rebecca was summoned to assist with a difficult delivery at the Salem Foundling Home, a charitable institution on the outskirts of town that cared for abandoned infants and children. Rebecca had delivered babies at the Foundling Home before. Unmarried mothers, desperate women with nowhere else to turn, girls barely out of childhood themselves who gave birth and then disappeared back into whatever circumstances had brought them to that point. The conditions at the Foundling Home were grim, overcrowded, underfunded, with infant mortality rates that would make modern readers shudder. It wasn't unusual for half the babies born there to die before their first birthday. On this particular night, Rebecca delivered a healthy baby girl to a young unmarried woman named Mary. The mother was perhaps 17, terrified, with bruises on her arms that suggested an abusive situation she'd fled. She held her daughter for perhaps 10 minutes, weeping quietly, before the matron of the Foundling Home gently took the infant away. "She can't keep it," the matron explained to Rebecca. "No means of support. The baby will be put up for adoption if we can find a family, otherwise she'll be raised here." Rebecca cleaned up her instruments, accepted her modest fee, and prepared to leave. But something made her pause at the doorway. "What happens to the babies here? The ones who aren't adopted?" The matron's expression grew weary. "Most don't survive, Mrs. Miles. We do our best, but resources are limited. The strong ones, the healthy ones with good features, those sometimes find families. The rest," she trailed off with a helpless shrug, "and the ones who do find families, how does that work? Families come looking, usually through connections with the Board of Trustees. They specify what they want: infant, healthy, particular coloring. We match them when we can. The Board of Trustees." Rebecca knew those names: Jonathan Peabody, Samuel Harrington, Robert Eldridge, Thomas Worthington. Every prominent family in Salem had representation on the Foundling Home's Board of Trustees. The same families whose babies sometimes died shortly after birth and were quickly buried. The same families who sometimes suddenly had nieces or nephews visiting who then became permanent members of the household. Rebecca felt something cold settle in her chest. How often does this happen? Families finding babies through the board? The matron seemed uncomfortable with the question. "I don't keep records of such things, Mrs. Miles. That's handled by the board. But I'd say perhaps 6 or 8 times a year, sometimes more. 6 or 8 infants taken from the Foundling Home annually by Salem's wealthiest families through private arrangements." Rebecca had delivered approximately 40 babies in the past year to those same wealthy families. 3 of those babies had officially died shortly after birth. Another 2 had been sent away to relatives, replaced by cousins who looked nothing like the biological children Rebecca had delivered. The mathematics of it made her sick. But it was what happened next that transformed Rebecca's concern into horror. 2 weeks after the delivery at the foundling home, Rebecca was called to attend Margaret Worthington, wife of Thomas Worthington, one of Salem's most influential merchants. Margaret was pregnant with her second child, and the delivery proceeded normally. A healthy baby girl with dark hair and a strong cry. But Thomas Worthington took one look at his daughter, and Rebecca saw his expression shift into something between disappointment and anger. The baby had features that were, there was no delicate way to put it, not quite in line with what the Worthington family would consider acceptable. Perhaps the child resembled Margaret's side of the family rather than Thomas's. Perhaps there were other factors at play that Rebecca couldn't know. What mattered was Thomas Worthington's reaction. "Get it cleaned up," he told Rebecca coldly. "My wife needs rest." 2 days later, Rebecca was summoned back to the Worthington house. She expected to check on mother and infant, but instead found Margaret holding a completely different baby. This infant was lighter in coloring, with features that would photograph well in the family portraits that wealthy families commissioned. "Mrs. Miles," Margaret said with an eerily calm voice, "I'd like you to examine little Emma. She's been fussing, and I want to ensure she's feeding properly." Emma. They'd even given the replacement baby the same name they'd planned for their biological daughter. Rebecca examined the infant mechanically, going through the motions while her mind raced. "Where is your other daughter?" she finally asked, unable to stop herself. Margaret's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you mean. This is my only daughter." "Mrs. Worthington, I delivered your child 2 days ago. This is not the same baby." The room fell silent. Margaret stared at Rebecca with eyes that held no warmth, no humanity, just a cold calculation. "I think your memory must be confused, Mrs. Miles. Perhaps you're thinking of another delivery. This is my daughter Emma, born 2 days ago. You delivered her yourself." "Mrs. Worthington." "That will be all, Mrs. Miles. I'll send your payment to your residence. Please show yourself out." Rebecca left the Worthington house with trembling hands. She'd just been given a clear message: accept the lie or face the consequences. That night, Rebecca made a decision that would alter the course of her life. She couldn't stop what was happening. She had no power, no influence, no way to challenge families whose wealth and status made them virtually untouchable. But she could create a record. She could document the truth that everyone else was willing to ignore. Rebecca purchased a leather-bound ledger from the general store, telling the clerk it was for her household accounts. But the pages of that ledger would hold something far more significant than recipes and expense records. On the first page, Rebecca wrote, "Record of births, Salem, Massachusetts, 1828 present, compiled by R. Miles, midwife." Then she began transferring information from her scattered notes into systematic entries. Each birth she'd attended received a detailed record. Date, family name, characteristics of the infant, reactions of the parents, and most importantly, any discrepancies between the baby she delivered and the baby that family ultimately raised. But Rebecca didn't stop there. She began investigating, discreetly asking questions, making connections, piecing together a pattern that would have seemed impossible if she weren't seeing the evidence with her own eyes. She discovered that the foundling home had adopted out a baby girl on the exact same day the Worthington infant was replaced. The adoption records, which Rebecca managed to glimpse through a sympathetic clerk, showed the adoptive family as Worthington, Thomas, and Margaret. The Worthingtons had adopted their own replacement daughter through the foundling home, creating an official paper trail that would legitimize the child's presence in their household. Anyone who looked at the records would see a generous, wealthy family taking in an orphaned infant, a charitable act beyond reproach. Rebecca began tracking the movements of babies in and out of the foundling home with obsessive detail. She cross-referenced dates of infant deaths among wealthy families with dates of adoptions from the foundling home. The correlations were undeniable. But what was happening to the original babies? the ones who were being replaced. The foundling home's records showed a spike in infant intakes during the same periods when wealthy families were replacing their biological children. Healthy babies were being delivered to wealthy homes, declared dead within days, and identical aged infants were appearing at the foundling home shortly thereafter. The replaced babies were being placed in the orphanage their own parents' families controlled. It was a system of breathtaking cruelty and efficiency. Parents who didn't want to raise a child who didn't meet their standards could effectively return that child like defective merchandise, replace it with a more suitable infant from the orphanage, and maintain complete social respectability. The biological child would be raised in poverty and obscurity at the foundling home, while a stranger's baby was presented to society as the legitimate heir to the family fortune. And the entire conspiracy was protected by Salem's most powerful families, who sat on the foundling home's board of trustees and controlled every aspect of the operation. Rebecca documented it all. Every birth she attended, where a baby was subsequently replaced. Every correlation between infant deaths and foundling home adoptions. Every family involved, every date, every detail. By the spring of 1832, Rebecca's ledger had grown to over 100 pages of meticulous documentation. She hid it beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. She told no one about it. She couldn't afford to. Her life depended on maintaining the illusion that she was an obedient, discreet midwife who asked no questions and saw no evil. But the knowledge was burning her alive from the inside. The breaking point came in August of 1832, when Rebecca was summoned to deliver a baby for Eleanor Crowninshield, one of Salem's most prominent socialites. The Crowninshield family's maritime fortune made them virtual royalty in Salem, and Eleanor's pregnancy had been announced with great fanfare in the Salem Gazette. The delivery was complicated. The baby was breech position, and Rebecca had to work for hours to turn the infant and assist Eleanor through a grueling labor. When the baby finally emerged, Rebecca saw immediately that he was healthy, strong, with a good set of lungs, and no complications despite the difficult birth. But she also saw the look that passed between Eleanor and her husband George when they saw their son's face. It was a look Rebecca had seen too many times before. Disappointment, disgust, rejection. The baby had a facial feature, a cleft lip, that was immediately visible and would require surgery to correct. In 1832, such surgeries existed but were risky and would leave visible scarring. The baby would grow up marked as different, imperfect. "Mrs. Miles," George Crowninshield said in a tone that brooked no argument, "I need you to leave now. My wife needs rest." Rebecca had delivered enough babies by then to recognize when she was being dismissed. She gathered her things and left, but she didn't go home. Instead, she waited on Charter Street, concealed in the shadow of a nearby building, watching the Crowninshield house. Just before midnight, she saw what she'd been expecting. A closed carriage arrived at the Crowninshield house. A figure emerged carrying a wrapped bundle, too large to be anything but a baby, and placed it in the carriage. The carriage left immediately, heading in the direction of the foundling home. The next morning, Rebecca made inquiries through her network of contacts among Salem's working class, the servants, the tradespeople, the ones who saw everything but were never asked about it. She learned that the Crowninshield baby had died during the night of respiratory failure. The burial would be private, family only. She also learned that a baby boy, approximately 1 day old, had been left at the foundling home in the middle of the night by an anonymous donor. The baby had a cleft lip and was in good health otherwise. 3 days later, Rebecca was called back to the Crowninshield house to examine their nephew, who had come to live with them. The baby was perfect, no cleft lip, no imperfections, just a beautiful infant who would photograph well and grow up to be a credit to the Crowninshield name. Rebecca recorded it all in her ledger, but this time she made a mistake. This time her disgust overcame her caution. "Mrs. Crowninshield," she said quietly. "What happened to your son?" Eleanor's eyes went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about. My son is here, and he's perfect. Your biological son, the one I delivered 3 days ago. What happened to him?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Eleanor stood slowly, drawing herself up to her full height. "Mrs. Miles, you're confused. You've been working too hard. Perhaps you should take some time to rest. I know what I saw." "Do you?" Eleanor's voice was soft, but carried an unmistakable threat. "Because I think you're becoming confused in your old age, making accusations against respectable families based on delusions. That's a very dangerous path, Mrs. Miles, very dangerous indeed." The message was clear: stay silent or be destroyed. Rebecca left the Crown and Shield house knowing her time in Salem was running out. She'd pushed too far, asked too many questions. The families would be watching her now, waiting for her to make another mistake. But she couldn't stop recording. The ledger had become her purpose, her mission. Someone had to bear witness to what was happening. Someone had to create a record that would outlast the conspirators' power and influence, even if that someone paid the ultimate price for their integrity. Through the fall and winter of 1832, Rebecca continued her work with the knowledge that she was living on borrowed time. The wealthy families of Salem still called her to attend births. She was too skilled to replace easily, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Servants who'd once been friendly became distant. She was being watched, evaluated, judged. Rebecca doubled down on her documentation. She began recording not just the births and replacements, but the broader pattern she was uncovering. The foundling home was essentially serving as a warehouse for babies, allowing Salem's elite to trade infants like commodities. Healthy babies from desperate unmarried mothers were being funneled to wealthy families to replace biological children deemed unsuitable. Those unsuitable biological children were being placed in the foundling home, stripped of their identities, and raised as orphans. Some were eventually adopted out to working-class families who had no idea they were raising the biological child of Salem's elite. Others simply died in the overcrowded, underfunded conditions of the orphanage. It was eugenics before the term existed, a deliberate attempt to control bloodlines and maintain the appearance of genetic superiority among Salem's ruling class. Rebecca discovered that the practice went back decades, possibly generations. She found burial records showing suspicious patterns of infant deaths among prominent families throughout the early 1800s. She found foundling home intake records showing mysterious spikes in abandoned babies during the same periods. The conspiracy wasn't just current. It was institutional, woven into the fabric of Salem's high society so deeply that it had become normal, accepted, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for it. But Rebecca was looking. And in January of 1833, she uncovered something that made all her previous discoveries seem tame by comparison. While researching birth records at Salem's town hall, she'd claimed she was verifying her own records for tax purposes. Rebecca found evidence of a parallel set of ledgers maintained by the Board of Trustees of the foundling home. These ledgers were kept locked in a separate office, but a sympathetic clerk who'd grown suspicious of the board's activities allowed Rebecca a brief look. What she saw made her blood run cold. The board was keeping 2 sets of records for every baby that passed through the foundling home. One set, the public records, showed the official story. Abandoned babies taken in, some adopted, some dying of various illnesses, all properly documented and beyond reproach. But the second set, the private ledgers, told a different story. These records tracked the true identities of babies who'd been replaced. They included the biological parents' names, the dates of birth and replacement, and the ultimate disposition of each child. Some were marked adopted to working-class family. Others were marked deceased, natural causes. But a disturbing number were marked with a single word that Rebecca didn't understand at first. Transferred. Transferred where? To what? The clerk who'd shown Rebecca the records didn't know. But he'd heard whispers among the Foundling Home staff about babies being taken away in the night to other institutions, babies who were never seen again. Rebecca spent the next 3 weeks trying to trace what transferred meant. She questioned servants, delivery men, anyone who might have information about nighttime movements to and from the Foundling Home. She cross-referenced every lead, every whisper, every half-remembered detail. And she discovered that babies marked transferred were being sent to the Danvers Asylum for the Insane. The Danvers Asylum, located just a few miles from Salem, was one of the largest mental institutions in Massachusetts. It housed hundreds of patients, adults suffering from what was then termed lunacy or melancholia, individuals whose families had them committed for reasons ranging from genuine mental illness to simple inconvenience. But Rebecca discovered that Danvers also housed a lesser-known ward, a wing dedicated to feeble-minded children and infants deemed unsuitable for normal society. The babies being transferred from the Foundling Home weren't being adopted or cared for. They were being institutionalized. Infants with physical abnormalities, developmental delays, or simply features that their biological parents found unacceptable were being committed to the asylum as mental defectives before they were old enough to walk or talk. They were being erased from society, locked away in an institution where they would live out their lives in anonymity and neglect. Rebecca managed to visit the asylum once, claiming she was inquiring about midwifery services for pregnant patients. What she saw in that children's ward would haunt her for the rest of her life. Rows of cribs filled with listless infants and toddlers, children who rocked back and forth repetitively, understimulated and neglected. Babies who rarely cried because they'd learned no one would come. The smell of unwashed bodies and unchanged diapers. The complete absence of toys, stimulation, human warmth. These were the children of Salem's wealthiest families, condemned to this living hell because they weren't perfect enough for the society their parents inhabited. Rebecca documented it all in her ledger. She recorded the names of children she recognized from her birth records, now institutionalized at Danvers under different names or no names at all. She documented the conditions. She created a comprehensive record of one of the darkest secrets in Salem's history. But creating that record put a target on her back that she could no longer ignore. Chapter 9. The Price of Truth. In March of 1833, Rebecca was summoned to a meeting with the Board of Trustees of the Foundling Home. The summons was polite but firm. Her presence was requested to discuss her continued services as a midwife for the institution. Rebecca knew it was a trap, but she also knew she had no choice. Refusing the summons would be tantamount to an admission of guilt, confirmation that she was hiding something. So she went, carrying her ledger hidden beneath her cloak, unwilling to leave it at home where it might be discovered. The meeting took place in the Foundling Home's administrative offices. Present were 5 members of the board: Jonathan Peabody, Samuel Harrington, Thomas Worthington, Robert Eldridge, and George Crowninshield. Every family whose secrets Rebecca had documented was represented in that room. Mrs. Miles, Jonathan Peabody began without preamble. It has come to our attention that you've been asking questions about the Foundling Home's operations. Questions about our record-keeping, our adoption procedures, and our relationships with other institutions. Rebecca kept her voice steady. I have been attempting to better understand the services available to mothers in difficult circumstances. As a midwife, it's my responsibility to be informed about all options. Is it also your responsibility, Samuel Harrington cut in, to spread malicious rumors about prominent families? To suggest that respectable citizens are engaged in what exactly? What accusations are you making? I'm making no accusations, sir. I simply keep records of the births I attend, as any competent midwife would. Records. George Crownenshield's voice was cold. We'd like to see these records of yours, to ensure they're accurate and don't contain any misunderstandings. There it was. They wanted her ledger, They wanted to destroy the only evidence of their conspiracy. "My records are private medical documents," Rebecca said firmly. "They're protected by the confidentiality expected between a midwife and her clients." "Mrs. Miles," Thomas Worthington leaned forward, "let me be very clear. You are balanced on a knife's edge right now. On one side is a quiet retirement, perhaps a small pension from grateful families whose children you've safely delivered. On the other side is public humiliation, accusations of lunacy, possibly commitment to an institution where your wild accusations would be dismissed as the ravings of a mentally unstable woman. The threat wasn't subtle. Give them the ledger and accept payment for her silence or be institutionalized herself." "Gentlemen," Rebecca said quietly, "I'm a widowed midwife with no family, no connections, no power. What threat could I possibly pose to men of your standing?" "No threat at all." Jonathan Peabody smiled. "As long as you remain sensible. We simply want to ensure your records are accurate. Bring them to us, let us review them, and we can all move forward peacefully." Rebecca stood. "I'll consider your request. You have 3 days, Mrs. Miles. 3 days to bring us those records or face the consequences." Rebecca left the foundling home knowing exactly what would happen. Whether she surrendered her ledger or not, the board couldn't let her live with the knowledge she possessed. The moment she handed over that ledger, she would meet with an accident. If she refused, she'd be committed to Danvers Asylum as mentally unfit, her record seized as the ravings of a madwoman. She had 3 days to decide how she would spend her final chapter. Rebecca spent those 3 days putting her affairs in order. She paid her outstanding debts. She wrote letters to the few distant relatives she maintained correspondence with, explaining that she planned to travel and they shouldn't worry if they didn't hear from her for some time. And she added one final, lengthy entry to her ledger. In that entry, dated March 18, 1833, Rebecca detailed everything she'd discovered. The systematic replacement of babies. The use of the foundling home as a clearinghouse for human trafficking. The institutionalization of unwanted infants at Danvers Asylum. She named names, provided dates, cross-referenced every piece of evidence she'd collected. She also wrote a personal statement that ended with these words: "I am Rebecca Miles, midwife of Salem, Massachusetts. I write these words in full possession of my faculties, sound in mind and body. If you are reading this ledger, it means I am likely dead or imprisoned, and the men whose crimes I have documented have attempted to silence me. I have no hope of justice in my lifetime. The families I accuse are too powerful, their conspiracy too well protected. But I believe in a justice beyond human law, and I believe the truth has value, even when it cannot immediately prevail. Let this record stand as testimony to what was done in Salem between 1828 and 1833. Let it bear witness to the children who were discarded, the infants who were erased, the lives that were stolen by those who should have protected them. And let future generations judge whether the men who built their fortunes on such cruelty deserve the honor and respect they demand." Rebecca wrapped the ledger carefully in oilcloth and placed it in a metal box, which she then hid in a location she'd carefully selected, beneath the floorboards of the basement in the Salem Custom House, where her late husband had once worked as a clerk. She knew the building well, knew the areas that were rarely accessed, knew exactly where to conceal the box where it might remain hidden for decades or even centuries. Then Rebecca did something unexpected. Instead of fleeing Salem or surrendering to the board's demands, she went on the offensive. She wrote a letter to the Boston Courier, one of New England's most prominent newspapers, describing in general terms what she'd discovered, not naming families specifically, but outlining the conspiracy of baby swapping among Salem's elite. She detailed the use of the foundling home as a tool for eugenics, the institutionalization of unwanted infants, the systematic erasure of children who didn't meet their parents' standards. And she sent copies of that letter to 3 different newspapers, along with instructions that if anything happened to her, the letters should be published immediately. It was a gambit, a desperate attempt to create enough public attention that the board couldn't simply make her disappear without consequences. The response came swiftly. On March 21st, 1833, Rebecca was awakened in the middle of the night by pounding on her door. She opened it to find a constable accompanied by Dr. Richard Hammond, the chief physician at Danvers Asylum. "Mrs. Miles," the constable said without preamble, "Dr. Hammond has filed a petition for your commitment to the asylum. He has sworn testimony from several prominent citizens that you've been experiencing delusions, making wild accusations against respectable families, and showing signs of dangerous mental instability." Rebecca looked at Dr. Hammond, who avoided her eyes. He was on the Foundling Homes Board of Trustees, of course. They all were. "I'm perfectly sane," Rebecca said calmly, "and I've taken precautions. If I disappear, letters will be published that will destroy every family involved in this conspiracy." Dr. Hammond finally met her gaze. "Those letters have been intercepted, Mrs. Miles. All of them. Did you really think we wouldn't have people watching the mail coaches? You have no leverage, no power, no hope." They'd been thorough. They'd anticipated her every move. Rebecca was taken that night to Danvers Asylum, committed under the diagnosis of delusional mania with paranoid features. Her house was searched thoroughly, every floorboard examined, every hiding place explored. But they didn't find the ledger, because it wasn't there. It was hidden blocks away in the custom house, exactly where Rebecca had planned. The official records show that Rebecca Miles died in Danvers Asylum on November 3rd, 1833, of pneumonia. She was 40 years old. She was buried in the asylum cemetery in an unmarked grave, her life's work seemingly lost forever. The Board of Trustees of the Salem Foundling Home breathed a collective sigh of relief. The threat had been neutralized. Their secret was safe. But they were wrong. Rebecca's ledger remained hidden beneath the Salem Custom House for over 100 years. The building underwent renovations, changes in function, countless administrative reorganizations, but the basement storage area where Rebecca had concealed her work remained untouched, too mundane to draw attention, too obscure to be thoroughly searched. In 1948, during a major renovation of the Custom House, a construction worker discovered the metal box beneath rotted floorboards. Inside was Rebecca's ledger, remarkably well preserved in its oilcloth wrapping. The discovery made headlines throughout New England. Historians initially dismissed it as fantasy, the delusional writings of a mentally ill woman. But then researchers began cross-referencing Rebecca's entries with official records from Salem in the 1830s. Everything checked out. Birth records Rebecca had documented matched official church and town records. Families she'd named were confirmed to have been on the Foundling Homes Board of Trustees. Death certificates for infants she claimed were falsified showed suspicious patterns. Multiple babies dying of identical causes within days of birth, all from the wealthiest families, all buried quickly in private ceremonies. Researchers gained access to the Foundling Homes' old records, including the secret ledgers Rebecca had glimpsed. They found them exactly where Rebecca said they'd be, still locked away in archives that hadn't been examined in decades. The parallel record-keeping, the transfers to Danvers Asylum, the systematic replacement of babies, all of it was verified. Perhaps most chilling, researchers found records from Danvers Asylum showing an unusually high population of infants and young children in the feeble-minded ward during the 1830s. Many of these children had no names, only numbers. Many died young. None were ever reclaimed by families or adopted out. Rebecca Miles had been telling the truth. The discovery triggered a historical reckoning in Salem. Genealogical societies realized that many of Salem's most prominent families had bloodlines that weren't what they claimed. Children raised as legitimate heirs were actually adopted orphans. Biological children of wealthy families had been erased from history. Their lives ended in asylum wards or lived out in anonymity among working-class families who never knew their true heritage. The scandal was enormous, but it was also old. Too old for justice, too distant for accountability. The perpetrators were long dead. The children they'd harmed were gone. All that remained was Rebecca's ledger, a testament to one woman's courage and the price she paid for refusing to look away. The Salem Custom House now includes a small exhibit about Rebecca Miles. Her ledger is preserved behind glass, open to the final entry where she wrote her statement about truth and justice. Visitors come from around the world to see it, to read about a midwife who documented one of American history's darkest conspiracies. But here's what most visitors don't know, what historians discovered only recently. Rebecca's ledger wasn't the only record she created. In 2003, researchers analyzing Rebecca's handwriting noticed subtle marks in the margins of her ledger, tiny symbols that seemed random but appeared with suspicious regularity. After months of analysis, cryptographers determined the symbols formed a simple substitution code. When decoded, the symbols revealed references to additional documents. See Journal A, Entry 47, or Reference Document B, page 12. Rebecca had created multiple records. The ledger hidden in the custom house was just the beginning. Somewhere in Salem, possibly still hidden, were additional documents, journals, letters, evidence that Rebecca had compiled but never mentioned in her main ledger. Insurance policies against discovery, perhaps, or simply a methodical woman's instinct to create redundant backups of vital information. Those additional documents have never been found, which means that everything historians have learned about Salem's baby-swapping conspiracy from Rebecca's ledger might be just a fraction of what Rebecca actually discovered. The full truth, the complete record of names, dates, and crimes, might still be hidden somewhere in Salem, waiting for another renovation, another curious worker, another accident of discovery. Salem's prominent families, the descendants of those who sat on the Foundling Home's Board of Trustees, have funded multiple historical research initiatives over the past 2 decades. Officially, these initiatives are about preserving Salem's heritage and ensuring accurate historical records. Unofficially, historians suspect these families are desperately searching for Rebecca's additional documents before anyone else finds them. Because if the ledger in the custom house was damning enough to rewrite Salem's history, what secrets might still be buried in those missing journals? What names haven't yet been revealed? What crimes remain hidden? Rebecca Miles died in an asylum, branded a lunatic, silenced by the very families whose secrets she'd uncovered. But she had the last word after all, a word that echoes through more than a century and a half, a testimony that couldn't be destroyed no matter how hard the powerful tried. And somewhere in Salem, her complete testimony might still be waiting to be discovered. There's a small cemetery on the grounds of what used to be the Salem Foundling Home. The building itself was demolished in 1962, replaced by a modern office complex. But the cemetery remains, protected by historical preservation laws, rows of tiny markers, most with no names, just dates. Infant, died June 12, 1829. Child, died April 3, 1831. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, babies who lived and died without ever being given the dignity of an identity. Historians now believe that many, perhaps most of these graves contain the children Rebecca Miles documented, babies who were replaced, discarded, erased from history because they didn't meet their parents' standards of acceptability. Some graves are empty, babies who officially died but were actually transferred to Danvers Asylum or adopted out to working-class families. The funerals were performances, the burials, theatrical productions designed to maintain the illusion. Other graves hold children who really did die, from neglect, from the terrible conditions at the Foundling Home, from the simple cruelty of a system that treated human lives as disposable commodities. On the anniversary of Rebecca Miles's death, November 3rd, someone leaves flowers at this cemetery. Every year, without fail, a bouquet of white roses appears, placed among the tiny markers with a card that reads simply, "Remembered by R.M." No one knows who leaves them. The cemetery has no caretaker, no regular visitors. The flowers simply appear. a mystery that Salem's historical society has never solved. Perhaps it's a descendant of Rebecca, continuing her work of bearing witness. Perhaps it's a descendant of one of the replaced children, honoring the woman who documented their existence. Perhaps it's something else entirely. Salem has always had a complicated relationship with its ghosts, but those flowers appear every November 3rd, marking the death of a woman who refused to forget the forgotten, who insisted on recording the unrecorded, who paid the ultimate price for believing that truth mattered even when the powerful wanted it buried. Rebecca Miles's ledger sits in the custom house, her words preserved behind glass. But her legacy lives in every historian who refuses to accept official narratives, every researcher who questions convenient stories, every person who believes that the powerless deserve to have their stories told. And it lives in those empty cribs at the foundling home, in the unmarked graves at Danvers Asylum, in the missing journals that might still be hidden somewhere in Salem. Evidence that the darkest secrets don't stay buried forever, no matter how deep you dig the hole. The babies Rebecca Miles recorded in secret have been silent for nearly 2 centuries, but their stories are finally being heard, their existence finally acknowledged, their suffering finally recognized, because one woman refused to look away, because one woman documented what everyone else chose to ignore, because Rebecca Miles believed that even the smallest lives, the most discarded children, the most powerless victims, deserved to be remembered. And in the end, that belief proved stronger than all the wealth and power Salem's elite families could muster. The truth waits patiently. It can wait for decades, for centuries if necessary. And somewhere in Salem, Rebecca's complete testimony is still waiting.